Dakota Territory, spring of 1882. The April sun spread gold across the endless prairie, where the wind carried the scent of dry grass and freshly cut pine. On the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a man lived alone on his sprawling ranch, a place where the hammer's strike and a horse's neigh spoke louder than any words. His name was Caleb Porter, 32 years old, a cattle rancher, orphaned young, who built his own 2-story log house with nothing but his calloused hands. People often said, "He's not afraid of loneliness, only of his past finding its way back." Then one windy afternoon, Hank Dugan's wagon rolled up to the porch. Caleb thought the mail-order bride he'd been waiting for had finally arrived, but instead of one woman, 2 stepped down. One was petite, with honey blonde hair and a navy blue traveling coat. The other stood taller, auburn hair glinting in the sun, dressed in a green gown. Both smiled, and both called out the same name, Mr. Porter. In that moment, the sunlight slipped behind the roof, leaving only the chill of the wind, and a question heavy in the man's heart. If destiny truly exists, then why does it mock us in such a way? A matchmaking file gone wrong. 2 women, each leaving behind everything they owned to find the man in the letters. Now, the 3 of them must live under the same roof where every glance, every breath, tests the limits of trust and love. But within that mix-up, perhaps, God was sending a miracle after all. Montana Territory, 1882. Across the golden plains stretching all the way to the horizon, the April wind swept through, setting a small porch bell gently ringing on the eave of a wooden house. The late afternoon sun poured its warm light over the pine boards, still fragrant with resin, the familiar scent that Elias Warren had lived with for 3 long years. He stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up, hands rough with sawdust. At 32, Elias was the owner of a modest cattle ranch on the southern edge of Willow Creek, a hard land where winters outlasted promises, and everything a man had, he built with his own 2 hands. The 2-story log house he raised wasn't a monument to pride, but a quiet reminder that even here, there was still such a thing as home. Far off, a dirt road cut through the grassland, its surface hazed with dust. A stagecoach rolled slowly toward the ranch, its wooden wheels grinding over gravel like the ticking of time itself. Elias knew that sound Hank Delaney's coach from town, bringing mail and supplies. But today, something in him stirred with unease, a weight that didn't belong to the wind. Inside his shirt pocket was a creased envelope sealed with the mark of the Dakota Matrimonial Agency, the same agency he'd written to almost 6 months earlier. On the frontier, men got used to silence, but some silences stretched too long enough to hollow a man out. Elias once believed he could live a lifetime without companionship, until one winter night, caught in a blizzard, he realized that no one was there to hear the mandolin he played into the empty dark. That very night, he'd written his first letter to a woman he had never met. Now, the stagecoach came to a halt. The horses stamped. The wind dried the sweat on their flanks. Hank Delaney jumped down, his sunburned face splitting into a grin. "Afternoon, Elias. Got something special for you today." Elias frowned, wiping his hands on his shirt. Before he could reply, the coach door creaked open. From the dim interior, a small figure stepped out first, a woman in a navy traveling dress, her honey blonde hair tied neatly back. She squinted against the light, dust on her shoes from the long road. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I believe you are Mr. Elias Warren, my intended—" Elias froze, His heart thudded once, hard like a stone dropped into still water. Before he could speak, the coach door opened again. A second woman stepped down, taller, auburn hair glinting copper in the sun, a dark green traveling gown worn from the trail. In her hand was a weathered leather valise. Bits of straw clung to her hat. "I'm Margaret Hale," she said, her voice husky from the journey. "And I also received a letter of engagement. From you." The air stood still. Hank blinked. Elias stared. Even the horses seemed to pause, shifting their weight restlessly. The sun caught his face half in light, half in shadow, just like the turmoil tearing through his chest. Clara glanced around the humble ranch house, eyes filled with shyness and a flicker of hope. Margaret stood straighter, proud despite her exhaustion. Each woman held a folded letter stamped with the same mark, J.V., matron, matchmaker. Elias drew a deep breath, hand tightening on his coat. I only sent one application. Just one." Hank spat into the dust, shaking his head. "Looks like somebody at that Dakota office messed up." "Elias, you've got yourself 2 brides for 1 wedding." The wind swept across the plain, swirling red dust around the 3 of them. 3 strangers caught in the wide, lonely breath of the frontier. Elias looked at their faces, 2 women, each carrying a story, a hope, and a fear. Both had sold what little they owned, left their homes, crossed miles of wilderness, all for the same fragile dream to find a place called home. He lowered his gaze, the weight of it heavy as the western dusk settling over the hills. Out here, where winter bit to the bone and silence was a second language, survival was never the hardest part. It was living with one's own heart that tested a man the most. Elias turned toward the cabin, 1 parlor, 1 bed, bare timber walls. Morality, decency, and human compassion all clashed within him. He couldn't turn either woman away, not tonight, not into the cold. But he couldn't let both stay either. At last, he exhaled, his voice low steady as the setting sun bleeding over the ridge. "Maybe. God's testing me, testing all 3 of us." No one spoke after that. Only the wind and the faint chime of the porch bell swaying gently, the soft sigh of the frontier, where every beginning starts with a mistake, and sometimes that very mistake is what leads us to our fate. That night, as the lamplight cast 3 long shadows across the wall, Elias realized he had stepped into a new season of life, one where right and wrong no longer had clear lines, and only hearts were left to learn how to trust again. Inside the small wooden cabin, the light from the oil lamp flickered across the rough pine walls. The scent of sap and firewood mingled in the air, the scent of a beginning none of the 3 had ever imagined. Elias added more logs to the fire. The crackle echoed like the whisper of a house that had long forgotten the sound of voices. Clara sat at the table, both hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Margaret stood by the door, still wearing her gloves, her eyes sharp and distant. No one spoke for several long minutes, only the wind tapping softly at the shutters, and the slow, heavy ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "There must have been some mistake at the Dakota matchmaking office," he said slowly. I only filled out 1 form. Sent it just once." Margaret turned, her voice hoarse but firm. "So did I." "The letter you sent, signed Elias Warren, spoke about this house. Your cattle. Your dream of a home. I carried that letter every mile of the way." Clara lifted her head, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "I have a letter, too. It's signed with the initials J.V. I assume that's your agent." Elias frowned, remembering. Yes, he'd sent his application to the Dakota Matrimonial Agency, received by someone named J.V. Matron. That must have been the root of it somewhere among the hundreds of lonely letters crossing the frontier. Someone had mixed up the files. He murmured, almost to the wind, "A single stroke of ink can change a person's fate." Margaret exhaled, setting her worn suitcase on the floor. Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "I sold my father's little shop in Springfield, even sold the wedding dress my mother sewed before she passed. I only had enough left for a one-way ticket here, Mr. Warren." Clara gripped her cup tighter, whispering, "So did I. I left Ohio with what I'd saved teaching school for 3 years. There's nothing left to go back to." The room fell silent. Elias looked at the two women before him, two lives standing at a crossroads with nowhere to turn. The cost of loneliness in the West wasn't just the long nights. It was everything one had to give up, just to believe in a stranger. And now, that belief was unraveling before his eyes. Outside, the spring snow hadn't yet melted. The wind stayed sharp, a reminder that in this land, everything was fragile crops, trust, even the human heart. Elias rose, drew the curtain aside, and spoke softly. "This house is small. One sitting room, one bedroom. There's no decent way for two women to stay here and keep their honor." He hesitated, eyes drifting to the wall where he had carved the days of his solitude. "I'll ask Mrs. Agnes Cooper, the widow at the neighboring ranch, if one of you can stay there for a while. As for tonight, I'll sleep out in the barn." Margaret protested instantly. "You don't have to do that. I can take the porch. I've slept through worse." Clara shook her head gently. "No, I'll stay by the fire. It's warm enough here." Elias looked at both women, his voice lowering like the whisper of night wind across the eaves. "You've both traveled 1,000 miles to get here. I won't have either of you face the cold again." A long pause. Then, all three shared faint smiles, awkward, fragile things, but enough to keep tears at bay. In the harsh lands of the frontier, people didn't cry out of pain. They cried when kindness became too rare. That night, Elias wrapped himself in a heavy coat and lay down in the barn, the horse's warm breath mingling with the cold wind. Through the walls, he could hear faint voices, Clara's and Margaret's, soft and distant, like echoes from a dream. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the snowy hills. Smoke rose straight from Elias's chimney. Someone had already lit the fire. When he stepped back inside, the cabin felt different. The table was neatly set. A kettle steamed on the stove, and the smell of baked bread filled the air. Clara stood by the hearth, wearing a simple dress, a wooden ladle in her hand. "I thought you could use a proper breakfast," she said with a shy smile. "Back in Ohio, I used to cook for the children before school." Margaret was tending the fire, turning to add, "And I'll take care of your chicken coop. Looks like something's been bothering your hens." Elias stood still, chest tightening. Two strangers, and yet, after a single night, they moved about as if they belonged. But beneath that calm, he sensed an undercurrent quiet, invisible, like the fire inside the hearth, steady, but ready to flare. That afternoon, he rode out to Mrs. Agnes Cooper's ranch. The widow, in her 50s, was known for wit and gentle heart. After hearing his story, she gave a low chuckle. "Out here in God's country. Elias, the Lord sometimes sends the wrong letter, but he rarely sends the wrong lesson. I'll take the little school teacher for now. You keep the other. Find out which one truly belongs. No one deserves to be cast out under the Dakota sky." Elias nodded, grateful but uneasy. He didn't yet know whom to trust, or maybe he simply didn't trust himself. When he returned home, the prairie was bathed in gold. The wind carried the scent of warm bread and soft laughter drifting from the cabin. Through the window, he saw the two women sitting by the fire, sharing stories of trains and faraway towns. In that glow, their faces looked the same weary, but each carrying a small, unextinguished light of hope. Elias stood on the porch, unable to step inside, and perhaps, right then, he understood the letters, the papers, the mix-up. They were only the surface. The real trial was not choosing between two women. It was learning how to open a heart that had forgotten how to feel. 3 days later, when the first spring wind carried the scent of damp earth and distant rain, Elias knew he couldn't stretch the situation any longer. The mistake was no longer just paperwork. It had reached the heart. And sooner or later, the heart would have to choose. That third afternoon, light rain fell over Willow Creek. Raindrops pattered softly on the wooden roof, creating a rhythm like the heartbeat of the house itself. Inside the small living room, the gray light from the window glinted off an old piano, one Elias had built himself the previous winter, not out of need, but out of loneliness he could never quite put into words. The room was neat and humble. On the walls hung a few sketches of the prairie. A small bookshelf by the hearth held worn volumes, Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and a few frayed Bibles. On the table in the center, 3 letters lay side by side, silent witnesses to fate's strange sense of humor. Clara Whitfield sat to the right, fingers entwined, eyes downcast over a letter written in Elias' own hand. Margaret Hale stood across the table, chin slightly raised, pride and hurt flickering in her gaze. Elias stood between them, silent as if he weren't just reading the words on those pages, but reading himself. He finally spoke, his voice low. Both letters mentioned teaching, loving books, quiet evenings on the frontier. They're almost identical, save for a few words. Clara looked up, her voice soft as mist. In your letter, you wrote that you wanted someone who could endure loneliness, someone who'd read the Bible to you on snowy nights. I practiced doing that all the way here. Margaret pressed her lips together, replying her tone sharper, though not unkind, and in mine. You said you needed a woman who could work the land, who wasn't afraid of dirt under her nails. I grew up in a blacksmith shop. Mr. Warren, I know work. I know reality. So tell me, what is it you really want in a wife? Elias took a half step back, his gaze flicking between them. His confusion wasn't from Margaret's question. It was from how deeply it struck. What did he truly want? Beyond survival. He exhaled slowly. I don't know anymore. Maybe I wrote those letters just to fill an empty space. Maybe I said the things I wished I believed. A pause. Outside. Rain whispered across the porch. The timbers creaked faintly, as if the house itself were listening. Margaret spoke, measured and calm. Back in Springfield, I was told men in the West make decisions fast. You've got 2 brides. Mr. Warren, you should choose before hearts get tangled worse. Clara shook her head, voice trembling. No, that's not right. He's not that kind of man. Marriage isn't something you draw lots for. Their eyes met. The distance between them vanished 2 flames, burning from the same ache. Elias bowed his head, his voice roughened by guilt. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't marry just to correct a mistake. The words cut through the air like a blade. Clara fell silent, eyes glistening. Margaret turned away. hiding whatever storm gathered behind her composure. The room went still again. The old piano gave a faint, broken sound, not from any hand, but from the wind nudging the strings, like the echo of restrained hearts refusing to break. Then a knock at the door. Elias opened it to find Mrs. Agnes Cooper, the widowed neighbor, her wool hat soaked with rain, umbrella dripping on the porch. "I heard what's happened." "Elias," she said gently, "perhaps it's time for a temporary solution before this goes too far." She stepped inside, her kind eyes moving between the two women. "It's not proper, nor fair to any heart, for two ladies to share one roof in a situation like this." Elias nodded, relief flickering behind his tired eyes. "I was about to ask for your help in that." Agnes smiled, her voice warm and steady. "Then it's simple. I've got an extra room. Whichever young lady wishes can stay there for now. I'll see to her comfort." Margaret spoke first. "I'll go. I've stayed in stranger homes before. I know what it means to owe someone. I won't be a burden." Clara looked up, lips trembling, wanting to speak but stopping herself. Perhaps she still believed fate hadn't brought her all this way, just for a quick goodbye. Elias turned to Margaret, voice low. "Thank you. It's only for a while. Until things are clearer. I'll find a way." Margaret nodded, the brown of her eyes steady and strong. "I know. Out here, everything, even the heart, has to weather a storm to prove it'll last. Mrs. Agnes lingered a while longer, offering a few words of comfort before leaving with Margaret. When the door closed behind them, the house seemed larger and emptier, as if a little warmth had been carried out with them. Clara remained by the piano. She rested her hand on the keys and brushed a few soft notes. The trembling melody floated through the room, tender as a sigh. Elias stood by the window, watching the rain sweep across the fields. Then Clara's voice broke the quiet low, thoughtful. Maybe all this didn't happen by accident. Sometimes God sends the wrong letter just to see who'll wait for the real reply. Elias turned, his expression softening. "You really believe?" That she nodded gently. "In a land this harsh, faith is the only thing that keeps us from turning bitter." He said nothing more, only stepped closer and adjusted the oil lamp. Its light spread over their faces, two souls thrown together by a clerical error. Yet something in their gaze had already begun to shift. Outside, the sound of hooves faded into the rain, Margaret riding away, leaving faint prints in the wet red clay. And inside the small wooden house, two people sat quietly, listening to the music of rain and trembling keys as though the entire prairie had slowed its breath to listen with them. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep by the piano, Elias cleared his desk. Amid the clutter of old papers, he found an envelope yellowed with age, addressed to a name he thought had been buried forever beneath the snow. Caroline West. The night in Willow Creek was so still. One could hear the wind whistling through the pines behind the house. The oil lamp cast Elias's shadow across the wooden wall, long and thin, like the years of solitude that had shaped him. On the desk, buried under scattered letters, he found the old brown envelope. The seal was faded, the ink pale, but the name Caroline West stood clear as if carved there by memory itself. Elias's hand trembled slightly as he sat down and opened it. The paper inside smelled faintly of time and of a winter long gone. "Elias, if this letter ever reaches you, maybe God hasn't forgotten two lost souls in the snow. I'm in Rock Springs, Utah Territory. The snow's been falling for 3 weeks, and the freight train's stuck. They say we won't move until spring. If you still want me to come home, write back. If not, pretend I never existed. Caroline. Elias read each line as if swallowing fragments of the past. Caroline, the woman he had once been engaged to, 3 years ago. The woman everyone said had died when her train derailed in the frozen Utah mountains. He'd buried that memory, told himself to move on. But now, in the quiet flicker of lamplight, the past returned cold as the wind sneaking through a half-closed door. He folded the letter and set it in the drawer, but his hands still shook. Across the room, Clara stirred in her sleep. The piano's lid was still open, catching the lamplight that shimmered faintly across the ivory keys. Elias looked at her for a long time. Something in that peaceful face pulled him back to the present, yet the past clung to him, stubborn as the last snow refusing to melt. The next morning, Clara rose earlier than usual. She brewed coffee, then went to tidy Elias's desk. As she pulled open the drawer, the old letter slipped free and fluttered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, and her eyes caught the name Caroline West. She hesitated, meaning to put it back. But then the sunlight touched the bottom of the page, revealing a faint pencil scrawl beneath the elegant signature. "I'll wait." Clara held the letter in her hands, her heart tightening with something she couldn't name. When Elias came out, she spoke softly. "I'm sorry. I found a letter on your desk." He froze, his expression tightening, like someone stripped bare of a secret. "You read it?" "Not all of it," she said quickly. "But I saw the name, a woman's name. Caroline West." Silence. For a moment. Elias's eyes seemed to travel far away to a place buried in snow and memory. Then, in a voice heavy and slow, he said, "She was my fiancée. 3 years ago. She left Montana for Utah to care for her sick mother. The train she took derailed. No one survived. At least, that's what they said." Clara stood still. The rain outside tapped softly against the window pane. In his face, she saw not just grief, but an old promise that had never been released. Her voice barely rose above the sound of rain. "Did you ever think she might still be alive?" Elias gave a tired smile. "I did. For the first year. I waited. Then came the second. When the third winter fell, I knew I had to let her go. But maybe I only buried the memory, never the feeling." Clara lowered her eyes, fingers gripping the edge of her sleeve. She understood some women come into a man's life not to stay, but to remind him what love once felt like. Elias walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked prairie. "I don't know if God is testing me or mocking me. Clara, when Caroline died, I thought my heart went with her. Then you and Margaret arrived. And now I don't know what's a mistake or what's mercy." Clara's voice was soft, trembling yet warm. "Maybe God doesn't mock anyone. Elias, maybe he just lets lonely souls find each other when they need a place to rest." He turned toward her, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of warmth in his eyes, like a spark catching after too many years of cold. But then he looked away, afraid of that feeling, afraid his heart wasn't clean enough to offer to anyone new. That afternoon, Margaret returned to the ranch carrying a few supplies from Mrs. Agnes. She saw Clara standing on the porch, holding a cup of cold tea. "He's thinking about her again, isn't he?" Margaret asked bluntly, eyes sharp. Clara looked up and gave a small, weary smile. "No. He's just trying to remember who he is." Margaret said nothing. Deep down, she understood a man like Elias. If he still loved a ghost, no one could truly reach him until he chose to open the door himself. That night, Elias sat alone on the porch. The moon hung high, silver light spreading across the wet prairie. He took the letter in his hands one last time, read it slowly, then fed it to the fire in the hearth. The paper curled, darkened, and turned to ash. The flame's glow reflected in his eyes no longer the shadow of Caroline, only the faint light of closure. From inside the house came the gentle sound of Clara's voice singing softly as she played Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing, an old hymn, a melody of faith and forgiveness. Elias closed his eyes, letting the song drift through the cracks of his heart, filling the places long left hollow as if someone were quietly laying a hand upon a wound that had slept too long. And in that quiet moment, he realized perhaps love never truly dies. It only changes shape from pain into the reminder that we are still alive. The next morning, Mrs. Agnes Cooper came to the ranch with a basket of freshly baked pies and a piece of advice sharp enough to pierce through the quiet. Elias, don't just ask who suits you best. Let them live beside you, and the answer will show itself. And that was how the 2-week test of the heart began. Morning in Willow Creek began with mist and the distant crow of roosters echoing from the valley. Late sunlight broke through a thin veil of fog, glinting off the beads of dew along the wooden fence Elias had repainted the day before. On the porch sat Mrs. Agnes Cooper, quiet, with a steaming cup of coffee. She was a woman who had lived through 2 wars, 3 droughts, and the loss of a husband and 2 sons, yet her eyes still shone. The kind of light that comes from enduring enough pain to understand kindness deeply. Around these parts, folks called her the midwife of the soul. Whenever someone got lost inside their own heart, they found their way to her porch. Elias stood by the doorway, hat in hand. He had invited her because he knew only she could speak to him with the kind of honesty that cut through silence. Mrs. Cooper, I don't know what to do anymore, he admitted. Both Claire and Margaret, they're good women, but I'm not sure my heart's ready. Agnes sipped her coffee, her voice calm and grounded like the hum of the earth itself. Elias, people don't choose with reason. They choose with their loneliness, and only the heart knows who can touch it. He said nothing. She leaned forward, steady and sure. Let them live with you. Work beside you. Just 2 weeks. A person can't hide who they are while laboring, sweating, and growing tired. By the end, you won't have to choose. Your heart will do it for you. Elias looked up, a faint light flickering in his eyes. He understood what she meant. Love wasn't something spoken. It was something shown, revealed in the smallest acts of every day. And so, the 2-week trial began. Each day, Elias divided the work evenly between the 2 women, not to compare, but to listen to his own heart in how they lived. On the first day, Margaret helped him in the cattle pens. She didn't flinch from mud or rope burns. Her hands were firm and quick, moving with the ease of someone raised close to the earth. Elias watched her silently. That image reminded him of himself as a boy at St. Andrew's Home for Boys back in Philadelphia. He was 12 then, too small to carry a full bucket, but doing it anyway for fear of going hungry. In that cramped orphanage, every child learned toughness. No one was allowed to cry. No one was allowed to need. Perhaps that was when Elias had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. Margaret worked beside him quietly, her gaze honest and unguarded. When the sun reached its peak, she handed him a piece of dry bread. "You forgot to eat," she said softly. "My father used to say a hard worker forgets his meal before he forgets his sorrow." Elias looked at the bread, then at her, and something warm stirred quietly inside him. On the 4th day, it was Clara's turn. She wasn't used to heavy work, but she had a way of lightening the air around her. She tucked wildflowers into jars on the table, brewed tea for him in the afternoons, taught the neighbors' children their letters, and at night read passages from Walden aloud by the fire. One evening, after reading, she asked softly, "Do you ever think people aren't lonely because they're alone, but because no one understands what they keep silent?" Elias gazed out the window, where moonlight fell over the still, open prairie. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps us from losing faith." Clara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides understanding. She knew this man carried wounds too deep to name. The days passed in rhythm roosters at noon. The hammers ring, wind sliding through the shutters. Yet beneath the repetition, something within Elias began to shift. When Margaret was around, the house filled with the sound of life, the splash of water, the scrape of boots, the small laughter that came after her short, practical remarks. When Clara was there, the house turned still and light like morning sun slipping through curtains, softening everything it touched. One evening, Elias sat again with Mrs. Agnes on her porch and told her all this. She smiled, folding her weathered hands on her knees. "Do you know why I asked you to do this, Elias?" she said gently. "Because when you live beside someone, you learn who you are with them. The question isn't who they are, it's who you become." She paused, letting the silence settle, before adding, "Do you need someone to help you forget the past, or someone to remind you who you used to be?" Elias didn't answer. The question cut deep straight into the dry soil of his soul. He knew she wasn't just talking about those two women, but about the orphaned boy inside him, the boy who'd never known the warmth of family or love. He sighed, voice low. "I just want a home, Mrs. Cooper, a place with children's laughter, someone waiting for me after a long day. Maybe that's selfish, but I'm tired of being alone." She nodded softly. "Then you already have your answer. Elias, the one who makes this place feel like home. That's the one who holds the rest of your road." Elias turned toward the window. Outside, he saw two silhouettes in the fading light. Clara teaching Margaret to play piano, both laughing softly. And in that fragile moment, something inside him eased like ice thawing after too many winters. Night settled. He walked down the hallway, the sound of wind brushing gently across the roof. The lamp still burned in the living room, casting warm light on the piano he'd built with his own hands. He touched a single key, one pure, lonely note filled the room. And in that sound, Elias understood sometimes a man's heart is like a piano. It won't play its true melody until it's touched with honesty and gentleness. At the end of the first week, Elias asked Clara to ride with him into town to buy seeds. The road to Willow Creek Market stretched more than 10 miles, and folks said that was the kind of road where two hearts could understand more than 1,000 words ever could. Morning unfolded across the prairie in quiet, steady light. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the far ridge, but the mist lay thick as silver smoke. Elias led the horse out from the barn, while Clara sat on the porch steps, tying her hair back, smiling faintly as she watched him fumble with the reins. They set out while the air was still cool. The dirt road curved between fields of golden barley and blue-gray hills of stone. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and wild sage, a fragrance only those who'd lived long on the frontier could call familiar. Along the way, Clara leaned down, scooping a handful of soil. She rubbed it between her fingers. Elias glanced over, puzzled. "What are you doing?" She smiled, her eyes glinting softly. "Checking the soil. My father taught me you can tell a lot by the color and the feel. If it holds moisture but doesn't cling, next season you can plant beans and carrots." Elias chuckled, the rare sound light and easy as the wind. Never figured a school teacher would know how to read dirt. "Where I come from, everyone learns a bit of everything to survive," Clara replied, voice gentle but deep. "Sometimes the things that feed our bodies are the same things that tie us to the land." Her words left Elias quiet. He looked out over the open prairie and realized he'd grown so used to survival that he'd forgotten what it meant to love the land, not just endure it. By the time they reached Willow Creek Market, the town was already alive with sound wagon wheels rattling, hammers striking in the forge, children shouting as they ran down Main Street. A white-painted church faced the small schoolhouse, and across the street stood a row of new storefronts, a general store, a blacksmith's, a bank, and a granary. Elias stopped the wagon in front of Otis and Nora McAllister's general store, run by an elderly couple known throughout the county for their kindness. The moment Otis saw him, he boomed with laughter. "Well, I'll be damned. Elias Warren finally brought a lady into town. That's rarer than snow in June." The whole store burst out laughing. Clara blushed and gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Nora hurried over with a warm smile and a teacup in hand. "Pay them no mind, dear. Around here, a bachelor's love life is bigger news than the price of grain." Clara laughed, and just like that, the air around them turned easy like they'd always belonged there. While Elias picked out seed packets, Clara helped Mrs. Nora restock the shelves, folding paper neatly and labeling bags with careful strokes. Her calm, graceful manner drew people in a quiet warmth no one could teach, only carry from a heart that understood others. The shop's door creaked open, and the sharp click of heels echoed on the wooden floor. A young woman entered silk dress of deep blue, a white lace scarf around her neck, her movements precise, her eyes bright and cold as winter wind. "Mrs.," Nora whispered, "that's Charlotte Ellery banker Silas Ellery's daughter." Charlotte smiled as soon as she spotted Elias. "Mr. Warren," she greeted sweetly, "I hear you've expanded your ranch. Quite admirable. In this region, a self-made man is a rare thing. My father would be delighted if you joined us at the bank's Sunday gathering, a perfect opportunity to meet people of standing." Her tone was honeyed, but her eyes measured. Clara stood quietly, not jealous, only cautious, the kind of wariness that comes from knowing the world often chooses glitter over grace. Elias hesitated but replied politely, "Thank you, Miss Ellery, but I'm not much for gatherings. I only know the work of the land." Charlotte's laugh was soft but edged like glass. "Oh, but sometimes, Mr. Warren, men of the soil should stand under the lamps to let the world see they can belong there too." Clara bent her head, pretending to busy herself with seed packets. Elias's voice dropped, calm but firm. "I believe true light doesn't need a lamp." The store went still. Charlotte blinked, then offered a thin smile silk hiding steel. "I'll tell my father you declined for now. Should you change your mind—" She left, her perfume lingering faintly in the air. "Mrs." Nora exhaled and shook her head. Rich girls always think they can buy everything, even respect. But sometimes, all it takes is the way a man looks at a woman to know who his heart already belongs to. At that, Clara looked up and met Elias's eyes. They were soft, sincere, and filled with something like gratitude. By the time they rode home, the sky had turned gold. The prairie rolled beneath the fading sun, clouds drifting purple across the horizon. Clara sat beside Elias, fingertips brushing the bag of seeds, They had more varieties than I expected, she said quietly. I'd like to try peas in the back garden. The soil's good there, open to the south wind. It might take. Elias nodded. All right, if they grow. Maybe I'll start believing in good omens. She smiled faintly. And if they don't, he laughed the sound rough. Real. Then we plant again. No seed sprouts the first time. Clara? The wagon rolled on, wheels creaking softly. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in copper and violet. They rode the rest of the way in silence, not the silence of distance, but the quiet peace that only two hearts beating in rhythm can share. A week later, Elias rode into town again, this time with Margaret. If the trip with Clara had planted quiet peace, then this one was a windstorm across the prairie. And amid the noise of the town, he would learn that not everyone seeks happiness by the gentle road. Morning sunlight came late to Willow Creek. The sky stretched blue and high, with white clouds drifting lazily like flocks of sheep. Elias led the wagon from the barn, while Margaret stepped out in a simple beige dress cinched at the waist, with a strip of leather confidence and pride woven into every movement. She didn't talk much. There was a strength about Margaret that seemed to sharpen the air around her. When she walked, her boots were dusted and worn, yet her back remained straight, like someone who'd long learned to stand firm against the wind. Elias noticed that and felt both admiration and a quiet caution. Where to first, she asked as the wagon rolled forward. Ellery Bank, he said. I need to sign the papers for the northern tract. The bank, huh, she tilted her head, half smiling. Where money decides who gets to dream. Elias glanced at her. You don't believe in money, Margaret? Oh, I do, she said. But I believe in it the way you believe in bitter medicine necessary. But no one should live off it. They crossed the wooden bridge into Willow Creek's busy heart. Compared to his trip with Clara, the town felt louder, brighter, pulsing with the hum of life. Shops stood open, blacksmith hammers rang, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread, sweat, and steel, the smell of work, of real life. They stopped before Silas Ellery's bank, the only red brick building in town. Inside, sunlight bounced off polished brass columns and gleaming nameplates. Margaret entered first, her stride so assured that heads turned. Elias followed, nodding to the clerk before heading to the desk to sign his forms. While waiting, Margaret struck up conversation with Silas Ellery himself, a stout man with a thick beard and the shrewd eyes of someone who'd made wealth by weighing the hearts of men. Mr. Ellery, she said, her voice smooth yet steady. I've heard your name brings security to this whole region. Truly a foundation we can all stand on. Ellery chuckled. Pleased. Why, thank you. Miss, where are you from, Missouri? She replied. Jonathan Hale's daughter. The blacksmith. I came here looking for a new start, and maybe a chance to build something of my own. It was the perfect balance, honest enough to sound real, skillful enough to win favor. Elias watched, quietly surprised. He had never seen this side of Margaret intelligent, composed, commanding attention without ever raising her voice. Then, just as they were stepping out of the bank, Charlotte Ellery appeared still in her deep blue silk dress, still wearing that polished, wintry smile. Mr. Warren, she said sweetly, the words sharp beneath their softness. And this time, a new companion, Margaret answered, polite but firm, Margaret Hale, a friend of his. Charlotte tilted her head, eyes glimmering with amusement. Ah, yes, rumor has it you're the man who sent for a wife by mail. Quite bold to stake your future on pen and paper. 2 brides. That must be a handful. The remark was light but barbed. Margaret held her gaze, steady and calm, though her hand tightened at the hem of her skirt. Elias looked directly at Charlotte, his voice low and clear, like hammer striking iron. "Marriage isn't a transaction. Miss Ellery, and anyone who sees it as something to bargain for, will never understand love." For a moment, the street fell silent. Charlotte's face flickered pale beneath the pride. Then she gave a thin smile and turned away, her perfume fading like smoke. Margaret said nothing, but when she looked at Elias, something had changed. Her eyes no longer held challenge, but quiet respect. They left town as the sun began to sink. The road home was painted in orange and gold, the oat field swaying like waves under the wind. Neither spoke for a while until Margaret finally said, "You spoke well back there. Elias, I used to think you were a hard man. And now I think I was wrong." She smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the violet ridges ahead. "I grew up poor, Elias. I used to think money was the only thing that could lift us from shame. I once dreamed of marrying a man with status so my father could hold his head high in town. But hearing you today, I think maybe it isn't wealth, but self-respect that makes a person noble." Elias nodded slowly, voice rough. "Self-respect, it's the only thing no one can give us, and no one can take away." Margaret looked at him, his face bathed in amber light, the kind of light that belonged to fire and to men who'd survived too many winters. The wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of earth and new grass. Something inside her went still, as if the walls she'd built from practicality were beginning to crumble, leaving just enough space for faith to take root. That evening, when they returned to the ranch, Mrs. Agnes Cooper was sitting on the porch, an old Bible resting on her lap. She looked up at them, her eyes kind yet deep. "Sometimes," she said softly, "God sends people to help us see ourselves not so we can choose them, but so we can choose the life we want to live." Margaret bowed her head, her voice low but clear. "Yes, ma'am, I think I saw that today." Elias said nothing. Inside him, emotions moved like quiet waves, not fierce, but steady. Something was shifting, settling, as if, at last, the pieces of his heart were beginning to find their place. In the days that followed, life on the ranch fell back into its quiet rhythm. But amid the shared meals and the steady labor, Elias began to realize something. It isn't only the earth that has its seasons of growth, the human heart does too. And sometimes it blooms in silence, far from anyone's intention. Morning mist clung to every blade of grass at Willow Creek. Sunlight filtered through the mountain gap, pouring down the valley like honey spilling over the land. From the barnyard, Elias spotted Clara wearing a plain brown work dress, sleeves rolled high bent over the chicken coop roof, hammering new shingles into place. He started toward her, then stopped, just to watch. There was something about her presence that made the world feel alive. Every movement was sure and efficient, a balance between gentleness and strength, the kind born from a life that had known work. When the sun rose fully, Clara wiped her brow and looked up to find him watching. She smiled a clear, effortless smile that swept the fatigue from the morning. "I think if we patch this roof, the hens will lay better. June rains come often, and dampness spoils the eggs." Elias leaned against the wooden frame. "You seem to know more about the coop than I do." She laughed lightly. "Where I come from, you learn by doing. When the land's tough, you make friends with it." Across the yard, Margaret, in a bright dress and spotless white apron, knelt to plant the first bean seeds. Her hands were clumsy, but determined. Elias noticed her pause for a long moment, watching Clara work, before quietly returning to her task. She was learning, though she'd never say it aloud. At noon, the crack of gunfire echoed from beyond the hill. Elias followed the sound and found Clara practicing her aim. A row of tin cans lined neatly along the fence. She raised the rifle, squinted, and bang, the can flew off the rail. Elias chuckled. "You shoot like a border scout." She grinned, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "My father taught me. Out on the frontier, if you can't hold a gun, you end up waiting for someone else to save you." He said nothing, but her words stirred something deep inside him, a memory of his mother, long gone, a gentle, steadfast woman who used to say, "You may not win against life, son, but you must always stand back up." He didn't reply, but warmth crept quietly into his chest like sunlight seeping into a place long frozen. That afternoon, Margaret worked in the kitchen with Mrs. Agnes Cooper. The older woman was teaching her how to make beef stew with white beans, a simple dish, rich and hearty. Margaret had always been clumsy, but today she was different, slower, more careful, laughing at her mistakes instead of hiding behind pride. When the stew was ready, she tasted it, then looked up with a soft, almost childlike wonder. "I never thought I'd find joy in a pot of stew." "Mrs." Agnes smiled, her voice as warm as embers. "When your heart's at peace, dear, everything you make tastes right." By dusk, Margaret stepped out to the porch and opened the lid of the old piano Elias had rescued from an abandoned church. She dusted it off, sat down, and began to play. The first notes were halting but real, and in that moment, the quiet log house filled with sound, imperfect, human, alive. Elias, hearing it from the barn, felt something tremble in his chest. He remembered the long winters of silenced nights when only the wind kept him company. Now, that music brought the house to life, not because it was flawless, but because the hands playing it carried a quiet longing to heal. That night, they all sat together at the long wooden table. Dinner was simple: Margaret's beef stew, Clara's cornbread, and a little apple cider from Mrs. Agnes. The lamplight fell softly over their faces, painting everything in warm amber like a memory made visible. Elias looked around the table, feeling something unfamiliar but profound: peace, belonging, and hope. He spoke slowly, as though thinking aloud. "When I was a boy at the orphanage, after the day's work we'd sit down with nothing but dry bread. No one talked, but every one of us wished for a real meal, a real home. If someone had told me back then that one day I'd be sitting like this under warm light, with laughter and the smell of cornbread, I don't think I'd have believed them." The room grew still. Clara placed her hand gently on the table and said softly, "Sometimes God doesn't give us what we want right away, because He wants us to be ready to keep it when it comes." Elias met her eyes. Something deep stirred again, something long dormant. Then he turned to Margaret, catching the faintest smile on her face softer than he'd ever seen it. No longer the woman who had to prove herself, but one learning to listen and to give. He drew a breath, his voice low but full. "I think the most precious thing isn't wealth or learning, but working side by side, sharing the breath of the land. Clara, you remind me that labor itself can be a kind of prayer." He turned toward Margaret, his tone gentle. "And you, Margaret, you've given this house another voice, not one of strength alone, but of patience and beauty." Margaret smiled. Clara remained quiet. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying in the scent of grass and stew. Mrs. Agnes lifted her cup, eyes glinting with quiet pride. "Then it seems, my dear ones, you're all building the same roof together, and a true home doesn't rest on wood or earth, but on the hearts that dwell within it." When dinner ended, Elias stepped outside to the porch. The night sky was scattered with stars. Behind him, the piano sounded again, this time smoother, warmer, alive. He smiled faintly and whispered, as if to himself, "Maybe I've started to find home. But on the frontier, peace never lasts long." 3 days later, the first storm of the season rolled down from the Rockies carrying not only hail and cold wind, but a test none of them at the ranch could have foreseen. The storm came faster than anyone expected. Wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, carrying sheets of hail that struck the wooden roof like bullets. In an instant, the whole Willow Creek Valley was swallowed in a heavy gray shroud. Elias ran from stall to stall, bolting doors and securing the horses, while Clara and Margaret fought to keep the kitchen fire from dying. When the rain finally eased, all three stood drenched, exhausted but alive. The house still stood, and beneath the fading roar of wind, Elias heard laughter, 2 women's laughter, weary yet real. It hit him deep in the chest. That sound a strange mix of gratitude and fear. Fear that happiness, once it flickered, would vanish again, like it always had before. A few days later, when the sky cleared, the town post rider appeared at the gate, an old man in a faded hat, handing over a wrinkled envelope. "From Rock Springs, Utah Territory," he said slowly. "Looks like it took the long way here, been weeks on the trail." Elias took the letter, staring at the familiar slanted handwriting in the corner. Caroline Whitmore. His heart sank. That name one he hadn't dared speak aloud in 3 years. He tore the envelope open. The words trembled on the page. "Elias, if this reaches you, then I'm still alive. I was hurt. On the way back to Wyoming, a Mormon family found me and took me in. I lost my memory for a long time. Now I'm in Rock Springs, trying to remember everything. If you're still in Willow Creek, please write me back. Caroline." The world seemed to narrow around him. For 3 years, he'd believed Caroline his fiancée. His lost love had died on the road to their wedding. He had forced himself to bury her memory, to learn how to live again. And now, she had come back, through a few trembling lines of ink. That evening, Clara and Margaret found Elias sitting alone on the porch. The letter lay beside him, heavier than any storm. Clara approached, ready to speak, but stopped when she saw his face. She simply set a cup of coffee next to him, then stepped back in silence. Margaret sat a few paces away, eyes searching, but restrained, unwilling to touch what hadn't yet been spoken. Elias finally looked up, voice low and a rough. "She's alive. Caroline." No one answered. Only the wind moved under the eaves, and a rooster's cry echoed faintly across the valley. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if there was another life after this one, I'd find her there, now. I don't know if I should be glad or afraid." Margaret lowered her gaze, hands clasped tightly. "Maybe God wants you to finish something that was left undone." And Clara, her tone soft but steady, added, "Sometimes, to finish, we have to face it, the memories, and ourselves." Elias nodded, but inside, memories tangled like roots. He knew whether Caroline returned or not, his heart would never be the same. Days passed. Together they mended fences, rebuilt what the storm had torn down. Mrs. Agnes Cooper stopped by, talking about adding a new room to the house in case Elias still wants to take on more help. Oh, or maybe, she smiled, a family. The words hung in the air like a gentle bell. Elias looked up. Clara was stacking wood by the window. "A new room?" she asked softly. "Yeah," he replied, his tone quiet. "If this ranch is going to last, it'll need more hands. And maybe more hearts." Clara smiled a small, tender smile, but in her eyes shone something else. A quiet vision of the future children's laughter echoing through the yard, the smell of supper smoke in the evening, a piano playing in the parlor. After Elias left, Margaret turned to Clara. "Do you ever think you'll stay here?" Clara looked out toward the grazing cattle, the open field bathed in golden light. "I don't know," she said, "but if I could plant a new life somewhere, I'd plant it here, where the soil's still honest and people still remember how to love through what they do." Her voice was soft, but it carried weight, the kind that came only from truth. Margaret said nothing, only nodded slowly. That night, Clara went to the garden to check the seedlings after the storm. She saw Elias standing by the fence, the letter in his hand, staring up at the sky, a sky thick with stars, silent witnesses to everything men could never quite understand. She walked up beside him. "Are you going to look for her?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I don't know. Part of me wants to know the truth, but another part is afraid that finding her means losing what I have now." "What you have?" Clara asked softly. He turned to her, his gaze lingering on her face, steady, searching. "Peace," he said, "and hope." She smiled, wind brushing through her hair. "Peace and hope? That sounds like the beginning of a family." "Elias." He looked at her for a long time, long enough for the stars to bear witness. Out here on the frontier, folks didn't say love easily. But sometimes a single look was all it took for the earth and the heavens to understand. The next morning, Elias sat down to write back to Caroline. Each trembling word felt like wind rattling a door to a past he thought was sealed. But when he folded the letter and looked out toward the field where Clara knelt planting seeds, he knew some roots, once they take hold, no storm from the past can ever tear them free. That afternoon, the sky softened after days of rain. Clouds broke apart, revealing a pale, misty blue. Elias was rebuilding the new corral when he noticed Mrs. Agnes Cooper walking slowly along the fence, her gray cloak brushing the grass, a small envelope in her hand. "Elias," she said gently, leaning on her cane, "there's something you should hear, and better it come from me than from someone else." Her tone was calm, but grave. Elias set down his hammer, wiped his hands, and led her inside. In the warm glow of the cabin, sunlight filtered through the glass window and shimmered over the rising steam of her tea, a thin veil of light, like memory returning. After a pause, she spoke. "Yesterday, I had a talk with Margaret. It seemed harmless, just a story or two. But something she said didn't sit right. She told me her parents had passed on. Yet an old friend from Missouri told me they're alive, still running a small blacksmith shop in Sedalia." Elias went still. He knew Mrs. Cooper wasn't one for idle talk when she spoke. Truth usually followed. Her voice softened. "She may have her reasons, but truth, Elias, truth, however small, is the cornerstone of a marriage." She rose, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're an honest man, and she needs to know that. If the love is real, it will stand the light." When she left, Elias sat for a long while. Wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the scent of fresh-cut wood and tea. He knew what he had to do to face not just Margaret, but himself. To ask how many fractures can trust endure before it finally breaks by evening. He found Margaret behind the house, hanging laundry in the golden light. The sunset washed her white linens in hues of fire and wings. She turned, smiling faintly at the sight of him. "Elias, did you need something?" "No," he said quietly, "but there's something I need to hear from you." His voice wasn't harsh, only heavy, like the sound of wood splitting in the hearth. She set the basket down, standing still for a moment before nodding. They sat on the back steps, looking out over the open field. The wind played through her hair, carrying the scent of damp soil. "I heard," he began, "that your parents are still alive, and that your father's a blacksmith, not a merchant. As you wrote, is that true, Margaret?" She drew a deep breath, eyes flickering between shame and fear. "Yes, it's true. I lied." "Why?" For a long time she didn't answer, staring at her hands. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I told the truth, you wouldn't choose me. In Missouri, a blacksmith's daughter isn't worth much. I got tired of people seeing my father's trade before they saw me." Elias said nothing. "I've lost so much already," she whispered, tears gathering. "I thought if I could start over, if someone would just believe I was enough, then maybe my words could make it real. But I see now, a lie, even born from longing, can't hide from the light forever." Her voice fell to a hush. "I'm sorry, Elias. I only wanted to be myself. But I began with dishonesty." He looked at her, and in that fading light, she no longer seemed the proud, calculating woman from town. She was simply human, flawed, trembling, and real. And in that honesty, there was a kind of beauty. "Margaret," he said softly, "I don't need perfect. I just need true. Out here on the frontier, truth is what keeps us alive through the storms. If we build a home on lies, it'll fall like a house without a foundation." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Can you forgive me? Forgive?" "Yes," he said slowly, "but trust must be planted again. Like soil that's been torn, it takes time before it can bear fruit once more." She wept then, not from despair, but release. Elias reached out, laying a steady hand on her shoulder. "From today on, Margaret, live as you are. I believe God doesn't place people in our lives by chance. Maybe He's teaching us to love through truth, not through the images we build to be loved." That night, after she had gone to rest, Elias remained in the parlor. The oil lamp flickered, casting his shadow long across the wall. The letter to Caroline still sat on the table unsent. He stared at it for a long while, then murmured to himself, "Honesty isn't only for others. It's for the man inside to know where he truly stands and who he's standing for." He picked up the pen, wrote a few final lines not to Caroline, but to his own heart. "I am no longer the man I was 3 years ago. I am not searching for the one I lost. I am learning how to keep the ones who remain." Then he folded the letter, blew out the lamp. Outside, the Willow Creek sky shimmered with 1,000 silent prayers, each one glinting like forgiveness, waiting to be heard. That night, Elias slept uneasily. In his dream, he stood between two roads. One led back to the past, where Caroline smiled and called his name. The other, toward a house glowing with warm light, where Claire and Margaret waited by the window. When he awoke at dawn, he knew sooner or later, the heart must choose its path. The morning sky over Willow Creek was so clear it looked washed clean by the night's dew. Out in the fields, Elias and Clara Whitfield worked side by side among the rows of young beans. The sound of the hoe striking soil echoed steady and calm, like the slow heartbeat of spring returning after the storm. Elias bent down, cupping the earth around a tender shoot. Then looked up at Clara, the woman with sun-browned hands and eyes gentle as a mountain stream. Between them was an unspoken harmony, the kind that exists only between two people who've shared labor, loss, and quiet hope. Clara smiled, her voice light and clear. "The soil's better than you think. In a few days, we'll see green all over." Elias nodded, voice low and warm. "I believe you. Clara, maybe the earth listens when you speak. That's why it's soft today." She laughed softly and bent back to work. A light breeze carried the scent of grass and wet soil. For that brief moment, time seemed to stop. No past, no doubts, just two souls and a field coming alive again. By noon, they were building a small fire for lunch when the sound of hooves broke the silence. A rider crossed the open plain, his coat whipping in the wind. When he drew near, Elias recognized Sheriff Amos Ridley, an old friend, a man who'd weathered as many winters as he had. Ridley dismounted, brushed off the dust, and pulled a telegram from his coat. "Elias," he said, voice measured, "word from Santa Fe. They just caught a con man named Victor Malloy. He confessed to posing as a mail courier, stealing letters from several women, one of them named Caroline Whitmore." Elias froze, his hand trembling as he took the paper. Ridley's eyes softened with understanding. "Seems she never meant to leave you. She was just one of his victims. Now she's in Rock Springs safe. Folks say she's working as a nurse and engaged to a young doctor." Silence fell. The prairie wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and the distant cry of a hawk. Elias gripped the telegram tightly as if it were the last fragment of a memory dissolving in his palm. Clara stepped forward, not asking, only resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "So, she's found her peace." He nodded. A quiet smile eased across his face. "Yes, and now I can let her rest, and let my own heart rest, too." That evening, they sat side by side on the fence rail, watching the sun sink over the fields, its golden light spilling across the land like honey. Elias took out his mother's old guitar and strummed a few simple notes. The mellow sound mingled with the breeze, and Clara fell silent, listening. "I used to think," he said softly, eyes fixed on the horizon, "that if Caroline were still alive, I'd have to choose between two women. But now I see there was never a choice. There's only one path, the one that leads home." Clara looked at him, voice barely above a whisper. "And have you found home, Elias?" He turned to her, meeting her eyes. In the fading light, his gaze was so tender she had to look away to hide the tears that welled unbidden. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Right here, in this land, with your laughter, and the green sprouting from soil that once lay barren. Clara, you've made this place a home." She didn't speak. She only nodded, her breath catching as the wind brushed past, and in that silence, their hearts found the same rhythm. That night, they shared supper with Mrs. Agnes Cooper. The old woman watched them quietly, smiling like someone who no longer needed words to understand. "The world's a wide place, Elias," she said gently, "but a true home only needs one hand to hold." Elias smiled and nodded. In the glow of the oil lamp, Clara sat across from him, her hair loose, her eyes reflecting the soft light like spring water catching the moon. For the first time in years, Elias felt both empty and full empty of burdens, full of something tender and alive. Outside, the new moon hung low, its light spilling across the freshly seeded fields. The earth was damp and warm, promising new life. And Elias knew when morning came, He would begin building an extra room, not for a hired hand, but for the woman he wanted to call his wife. The next morning, the sound of hammering echoed through the yard as Elias began framing the new room. Each strike didn't just drive nails into wood, it sealed another door of his past. And when Clara came out with a pot of hot tea, he smiled for the first time, feeling he wasn't merely surviving on the frontier, but truly beginning a life. Spring came early that year in Willow Creek. The snow melted fast, uncovering tender shoots of grass stretching toward the sun. Along the muddy road into Cedar Ridge, a stagecoach rolled slowly forward, its wheels creaking over thawed earth like the quiet breath of the land after a long winter. Inside sat Lydia Hale, back straight, hands clasped tightly around an old wooden valise. Her hair was pinned neatly, her gray coat simple a far cry from the polished woman who had once come west chasing the promise of marriage. She was no longer a woman seeking escape, but one seeking herself. Cedar Ridge was a small town, but alive children ran around the newly built schoolhouse. The ring of hammers echoed from the forge, and the scent of baked bread drifted from Nora McAllister's shop. Lydia stopped her horse at Mrs. Burke's dress shop, where a modest room above the store was waiting. "Miss Hale, Mrs.?" Burke greeted her warmly. "The room's ready, just like you asked." Lydia nodded, smiling faintly. A strange lightness welled up inside her, as if, for the first time, she didn't have to run or prove anything. All she had to do was begin again. That afternoon, she visited Father Galloway, the old priest who had helped her secure a position, teaching music at the local school. "The children here need someone like you," he said kindly. "Not just to teach music, but to remind them that beauty can still rise from our mistakes." Lydia smiled. That evening, she taught her first class. The piano is old, its ivory keys yellowed, yet every note rang clear, pure, like faith rebuilt. The children laughed when she struck a wrong note, and she laughed with them, a sound honest and free, untouched by pretense. One morning, as Lydia watered the small plants on her windowsill, a familiar figure appeared below Charlotte Ellery, the banker's daughter from long ago, still elegant, but now calm, stripped of the haughty edge she once carried. "I heard you've been teaching music here." "Lydia," she said softly, "I'd like to ask you about a little idea of mine." "What kind of idea?" Lydia asked, looking up. "A women's literary society right here in Cedar Ridge. I could use someone to lead the music program. And I think we started on the wrong foot once. Maybe we can start again." Lydia paused, eyes softening. Then she smiled. "I'd be honored, Charlotte." And so they did. On spring afternoons, the little upstairs room above the dress shop filled with laughter, music, and trembling yet sincere voices reading poetry aloud. Two women who had once been rivals now became friends, not because they shared the same dreams, but because they both knew what it meant to lose and to begin again. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, Elias received a letter from Rock Springs. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, and even Caroline Whitmore. He read in silence. "Dear Elias, I heard you are well, and still keeping the ranch. Thank the Lord for that. I'm now teaching in Rock Springs a quiet, simple life. I'm soon to be married to Dr. Andrew Miller, the man who saved me after the robbery years ago. Please know that I never meant to leave you. Fate simply led us down different roads. I hope you find true happiness as I have. Caroline." Elias folded the letter slowly. He felt no pain, only a soft calm, as though a circle had finally closed. The past no longer haunted him. It simply existed. Like an old road he could look back on with peace. but no longer walk. That afternoon, he strolled the meadow with Clara and Mrs. Agnes Cooper. Spring rain had just passed. The young willows swayed in the breeze. "I got a letter from Caroline," Ilias said quietly. "She's well and soon to be married." Clara nodded, her voice warm. "I'm glad for her. And for you." Ilias turned to her, eyes gentle. "Thank you. Clara, she was my beginning. But you're my home?" They stood side by side, saying nothing more. In the violet dusk of Montana, only the sound of wind over the fields remained, and a quiet laughter shared between two souls who had finally found where they belonged. In Cedar Ridge. Lydia finished her last class of the day. She closed the music room door and looked outside. The sunset bathed the rooftops in honey gold light. Children's laughter echoed down the street, mingling with the distant rattle of a wagon. For the first time, her heart felt utterly still, not empty, but peaceful. No one in the frontier towns spoke of mail-order brides anymore. They only spoke of the 3 women of Willow Creek, 3 strangers from distant places who had somehow found their way west and, through loss and grace, found home, found faith, and most of all, found themselves. Summer came, and the first wheat bowed heavy with grain. Clara stood in the field, her dress kissed by sunlight, while Ilias walked toward her from afar, wearing a smile he could no longer hide. In Cedar Ridge. Lydia wrote a short letter to Willow Creek. "We've all found our own harvest, haven't we?" And beneath it, she drew a single stalk of wheat, a small emblem of the quiet beginnings gifted by the frontier. It was spring of 1883, and the town of Cedar Ridge bloomed in white apple blossoms. The church bell rang clear across the bright blue sky. People came from miles around, arms full of wildflowers, faces lit with easy smiles. Today was the wedding of Ilias Warren and Clara Whitfield, the love story every heart on the frontier had watched unfold over 2 long years. The small pinewood church where Reverend Samuel Pike would officiate was dressed in dry grass, yellow daisies, and strips of rough linen ribbon. No luxury, no lace, but honest beauty, the kind born from labor and faith. At the old piano sat Lydia Hale, her hands trembling slightly as they touched the ivory keys. She smiled, not the smile of longing, but of peace. She had come to understand that sometimes happiness means watching others find what you once searched for. As Ilias and Clara entered, music filled the air, soft and pure, like the land itself giving its blessing. Clara wore a simple linen gown, hand-stitched by Lydia and Charlotte Ellery the night before. Her hair was pinned loosely, adorned with a sprig of young willow, a symbol of renewal. Sheriff Amos Ridley stood near the back pew, hat in hand. When the music paused, he stepped forward and handed Ilias a small envelope. "Last bit of news from Rock Springs," he murmured. "Thought you'd want to know." Ilias opened it, scanning the few lines, then looked up, eyes calm, a faint smile on his face. Caroline Whitmore, the woman he once believed lost, was now married to Dr. Andrew Miller. They were teaching and practicing medicine in Utah, planning to open a clinic for immigrant families. Clara gently squeezed his hand. Ilias nodded. "The past," he said softly, "finally has a place to rest." And as the Reverend began the vows, silence fell across the church. Only the whisper of wind through the wood and a beam of pale gold light graced their faces. "Marriage," said Reverend Pike, "is not the union of 2 perfect souls, but of 2 hearts brave enough to grow together through their imperfections." Clara smiled, tears bright in her eyes. "I do," Ilias answered, steady and deep as the earth itself. "So do I." When the vows were done, Lydia played the closing song Shenandoah. The melody drifted out through the open windows, across the fields, and into the wind. Outside, Mrs. Agnes Cooper wiped a tear with her old handkerchief. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "the children of this land have finally found their home." Sheriff Ridley stood beside her, nodding. "Aye," he said quietly, "and there's nothing left to chase, only lives to be lived." That evening, the townsfolk gathered in the yard behind Elias's farmhouse. Long tables stretched across the grass, covered with bread, apple cider, smoked ham, and wildflowers the children had picked by the creek. Charlotte brought the first tulips of the season from Cedar Ridge. Lydia led the small-town band. As the sun sank low, laughter carried through the golden air, mingling with music and the scent of warm soil. Elias turned to Clara, his eyes glowing with peace, a light no frontier storm could ever dim. "Clara, do you see it? See what she asked? Folding the napkins neatly? Home," he said simply. "Right here." She smiled. "Home isn't the land, Elias. It's the person who makes your heart know you've arrived." He fell silent, then reached for her hand, a small gesture. But in the hush of dusk, it felt like the greatest thing in the world. Weeks later, when Lydia returned to Cedar Ridge, she sent them a short letter. "I've started teaching extra music lessons at the church. The literary society is thriving, and Charlotte has begun writing her first essays. Thank you both for reminding me that every heart can find its way home, no matter how lost it's been." At the bottom, she signed her name and drew a small stalk of wheat, the same symbol of harvest they all had earned in their own way. That summer, Clara's garden came alive with color. Bean vines, corn, and tomatoes grew along the new wooden fence. In the yard, Elias was finishing another small room for the child they hoped would come by winter. As the late sun poured across the fields, they sat on the porch, listening to the cicadas, the smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchen. Before them stretched the boundless Dakota Plains gold, endless and forgiving. Above, flocks of geese crossed the sky in a perfect V, heading north. Clara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. "I think this place will grow with us," she whispered. He smiled. "And when we're old, what we planted here will become shelter for those after us." She looked up at him, eyes gleaming in the amber light. "Out here, no one's truly alone, not if they're willing to open their heart." And so, beneath the vast Dakota sky of 1883, a small wooden house stood as a testament to love, to kindness, to the rebirth of the human spirit, not built by miracles, but by two steadfast hands and a quiet faith that whispered, "Where the one you love is, there is home." Years later, they still spoke of that spring wedding, not for the flowers, nor the music, nor even the bride's dress, but because, in the eyes of two ordinary souls, people saw something rare on the wild frontier, peace the kind only true love can sow. Amid the wild frontier, where the wind sweeps endlessly across the Dakota Plains, we find not just a love story, but the journey of souls finding their way back home. Aaliyah, Clara, and Lydia, three hearts born from three different kinds of loneliness, crossed paths in the harshness of life. And from that meeting, they learned a truth as old as the land itself. Home is not a place you reach. It's the person who makes your heart know you've arrived. This story reminds us that the past, no matter how painful, can be laid to rest through forgiveness. That true love is not found in perfection, but in the courage to stay when the other is still learning, still afraid. Out there on that unforgiving soil, they built more than a house, they rebuilt faith. Faith that kindness and sincerity are still the most enduring lights that shine through every storm. And to you who are listening, if you've ever felt lost, if your heart has been broken or wandering, remember this: as long as you still have the strength to plant even a single seed of love, the harvest of peace will always be waiting for you ahead. Thank you for joining us on Frontier Heart Stories, where every tale is a gentle note in the music of the frontier and in the song of the human spirit itself. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it to spread its warmth, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more journeys of love and renewal from the heart of the American frontier.